Okay, so it's a real pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker tonight, Dr. Julia Parrish. And as we all read in the Pygmy Owl, Julia is a highly accomplished professor of fishery sciences at the University of Washington and has done extensive work regarding coastal birds, seabirds. On top of that, Julia is the Associate Dean of the College of the Environment, also at UW. But tonight, the focus will be on her amazing award-winning citizen science program, which was started in 1999. Julia raised the money, put together, and ultimately became the executive director for COASTS, which stands for the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team. And so with a small staff and what has grown to more than 1,000 local volunteers per year, they collect data and monitor the health of our coastal waters. Apparently at over 450 sites, as far south as the Mendocino coast in Northern California, all the way to the northernmost tip of Alaska in the Arctic. So the largest beach bird monitoring network in the world. And with that, thank you, Julia, for joining us tonight. And we'll give the floor over to you.
Well, thanks, Gary. That was a lovely introduction. And y'all might be thinking, well, they're probably the only beach bird program in the world, so that's why they're the largest. But actually, amazingly enough, there are beach bird programs in many different parts of the world. So let me just share my screen with you. I'm an academic, so I live by giving PowerPoint, so that is what I am gonna do. Okay, so as Gary mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Washington. I'm in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences, and I also am in the biology department. So part of my job is to be a professor and teach undergraduates and mentor graduate students and postdocs in their research. And I'm also the associate dean of our College of the Environment. And there my job is to try and tell faculty what to do, and they never listen to me because that's how faculty are. But nights and weekends, I can indulge in my great passion, which is the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, or COAST for short. And that's what I really want to talk about with you this evening. So a few decades ago, actually, we sat around and thought about this general question: can citizen science be another part of the toolbox of science, of mainstream science, right? And there's two things to remember about citizen science. One is that citizen science is free choice public participation. That is to say, participants are free to join and they're also free to leave. And that means the things that you provide people with have to interest them so that they stay involved and engaged. And the second thing about citizen science is that it should include an authentic piece of science with scientific outcomes. So you're not just asking people to do stuff and then you're putting that information in a digital drawer somewhere. You're actually going and doing stuff. So it's science that matters, science that can make a difference. There's a bunch of different ways that that's done across the world, and I'm just going to show you a brief sketch of a few different CITSI programs that focus on marine biodiversity. And this is one of my favorites. It's the Weddell seal count. So this is a camera trap program where cameras are set up on the Weddell ice shield, and pictures are taken of Weddell seals as the ones that you see here. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures, much more than researchers could look at. And so people are recruited to look at these pictures, count the number of seals, decide whether they're just adults or pups or both, and what behavior they're doing. And different people are looking at the same pictures, and then an automated routine decides what's really in the picture based on what multiple people are saying. So that's very, very cool. This is another kind of marine citizen science. This is deploying actual sensors where people are taking sensors into the environment. This happens to be one called SmartFin, and this is in collaboration with surfers worldwide, and participating surfers get a little fin. You can see the guy here is clipping it onto the bottom of his board, and it records the temperature. And this long trace that you can see, the blue is the temperature at the Scripps Pier. Scripps is in San Diego, and the black dots are the same recordings from SmartFins that were deployed on surfboards in the same area, and you can see how accurate they are. So that's great. It would give us the ability to have sea surface temperature at many, many, many locations around the world. Citizen science programs can also collect actual samples. There are a lot of programs that NOAA runs. Mussel Watch and Oyster Watch are just two of them. These are at locations on the West Coast, on the East Coast, on the Gulf Coast, and also in the Great Lakes. Samples, shellfish are collected and sent in, and we use these samples to gain information, for instance, about whether those shellfish are harboring toxins and whether the harmful algal bloom alert should be extended to those areas. So this is a really great interaction with lots and lots of residents in coastal communities that keeps literally our food safe. This is one of my favorite marine citizen science programs. This is the REEF program, which stands for Reef Environmental Education Foundation. It's a fish program, although they also do invertebrates. It started in coral reef environments, so warm water environments around the world. And REEF recruits people who dive and like to view fish. And they get to actually go online to REEF and do fish webinars, or fishinars, they call them, become competent in identifying fish. And then they're basically doing life listing when they're out doing their dive. So REEF has extended to most coastal environments, including cold water environments where we are in the coast of Washington and actually up into Alaska. And the REEF data set allows us to do all kinds of things about monitoring fish and invertebrate biodiversity. This is a great program that's focused on the Salish Sea, mainly the south side of the Salish Sea, so Greater Puget Sound and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And this is a crab team, and it's set up by Washington Sea Grant. And here, lots and lots of coastal residents are trained to go out and monitor for this little guy. This is the European green crab. It's an invasive species which showed up a few decades ago on the West Coast and has been gradually moving north and into Puget Sound. We're worried about this crab because it really changes the mudflats and the eelgrass meadows when the population of this crab gets too high, and thus may mean future problems for salmon and Dungeness crab. And so here there's a lot of trapping, and that's what people are doing. In the COASTS program, we do species identity and where birds are found and when they're found. And we're not doing live birds, we're doing birds in hand or dead birds. So lots of different things that you can do with citizen science. And of course, I'll explain a little more about COASTS in a minute. But first, I want you to think about this. What's the goal of citizen science? And I have 4 goals here, and they're all equally valid. And some programs have 1 and some have all 4. I'm a scientist, so I tend to think the goal is science. That is gathering information in service of understanding how the world works better, and or helping to fix some part of the world that's gone cattywampus, usually because of something that people have done. But there are at least 3 other goals that are really important in citizen science. One is education. And people want to join because they just want to learn more. They want a new avenue to learn more about their own backyard, their own environment. One is enjoyment. People sign up for citizen science programs because they're offering things that people are interested in and motivated to do. And the third thing is community empowerment. That is, with citizen science information at scale given back to communities on a regular basis, communities are often empowered to do things, be better stewards of their local natural environments. But before I tell you about citizen science, I want to just do a brief segue into seabird natural history, just telling you some overview things. You probably know most of these things, but just in case you don't, I thought I would put these in here. The first thing is that across all marine birds, body shape really indicates something about ecosystem use. So you can look at this southern albatross, an open ocean species with very, very long, thin wings, high aspect ratio, not unlike the long distance runner shown here, right? So just as the body shape of the runner indicates the kind of athleticism she is engaged in, the southern albatross body shape tells us that that's an open ocean species and gives us clues about how that bird makes its living. The tufted puffin, on the other hand, is a little more like a football with wings, so very short, stubby wings, and its body shape and wing span indicates that it is a coastal species, and it's not only going to fly in air, it's going to fly underwater. So just like this wrestler has a very, very different build from the long distance runner, indicating that she makes her athleticism with strength. That's what we see from the tufted puffin. And then California gulls, these are coastal species that are kind of in between these two extremes. So just one thing to think about is when you have a bird in hand or you see a photograph of a bird, what the bird physically looks like can tell you a lot about what it does. The other thing is that seabirds live a long time. So the average life expectancy for people worldwide is about 70 years. People in the US can best that. It's about 80 years in the US right now. But what about birds? Well, gulls live anywhere from 15 to 40 years. Murres, relatives of the puffins, live somewhere between 20 and 25 years. And albatross, get this, live 50 to 70 years. So one way of thinking about this is that after a long time of humans on the earth, they're finally getting to the point where they can live as long as birds can. The third point I want to make is that raising kids takes a lot of work. So anybody who is a parent or a grandparent knows that, man, they can put you to sleep. It's just constant work to raise kids. And this is exactly the same thing for birds. So for most marine birds, they're only going to have one chick a year. Occasionally, groups of species like the larids, the gulls are going to have 2 or even 3 eggs in a clutch. But for many species and families of birds, it's 1 chick a year, and it takes both parents to raise that chick, to incubate the egg, and to go out and fish and feed that chick. And all of that work means that the parents are not feeding themselves as much as they would otherwise, and so they lose weight throughout the season. And this means that post-breeding, right at the end of breeding, that's a particularly sensitive, crucial time for marine birds because they are at the lowest weight of the year. So if anything like an untoward storm comes along, it can really do a lot of birds in. And the fourth thing that I want to point out for seabirds is that many seabirds migrate seasonally. Some species don't, like murres, they just sort of disperse out from the colonies. But species in the family of albatrosses, these are the tube-nosed birds or procelariids, like the shearwater and the fulmar shown here, they migrate and range over the entire ocean. So the average distance for US people to vacation is 400 kilometers a year round trip. But compare that to a city shearwater, that round trip per year, 64,000 kilometers. Northern fulmars, 25,000 kilometers. So these birds migrate a long way. And what that means is the entire ocean is their home. So when we think about stewarding locations and preserving and sustaining species of seabirds, it means that we have to take the entire ocean into account. So now I want to switch, not from live birds, I want to switch to dead birds. And I want to create for you a natural history of dead birds. And that's basically what the COASTS program does. COASTS stands for Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team. So we actually run 2 data collection programs. One is on marine debris. It's a newer program. We started it in 2016. And people in our marine debris program are going out and learning how to count marine debris in specific ways of 3 different sizes. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the 3 bears, large, medium, and small, and then characterize that debris and photograph it. And we use that information to tell us to basically map the debris load in the Pacific Northwest. But the main program that I want to tell you about tonight is our beach bird program. So what's it mean to participate as a beach birder? You choose a beach, your beach. Might be a beach that you live near, might be a beach that you go to regularly, walk your dog on, met your partner on, take your grandkids to, meet your friends. But it's a beach that you know about and care about. And we're asking you to survey that beach monthly, starting from the same location on the beach and surveying all of the beach area to a standard turnaround point before you come back. And when you are doing that, you're looking for dead birds, literally birds that have washed in on the tide. And when you find one, you snap on some gloves, as the people in this picture have done, to examine. If you're the examiner, bird examiner, or if you're the pencil, the person writing the data, you are also the person looking at the field guide, and we have a field guide to dead birds that I'll show you in a minute. The kinds of information that coasters collect are information about the type of the foot, the morphology of the foot. They make 3 standard measurements of the bill, of the foot, and of the wing. And they take 2 standardized photographs. And you can see here, it's very easy to take a photograph of a dead bird. You can pose it. Also, you can put a photographic ruler in the photograph so that our data verifier can see what's going on. And by the way, we in the Coast Office verify every single one of the carcass photographs that come into us. So how do people actually identify dead birds? Well, you got to have a key, you got to have a guide, right? So that you know what's going on. It doesn't look like this, although I still laugh at this. Somebody made this for us years ago. Our Alaska field guide, actually, this is our Alaska field guide, looks like this. We actually have 3 field guides, one to Alaska, one to the Pacific Northwest, and one to the North Atlantic. So in the Coast Field Guide, you can figure out a dead bird in 3 easy steps. First, you go to the foot key and you answer some very simple questions, which have very simple drawings attached to them to get to a foot type family. Once you've found the foot type family, you go to the foot type family page. Here is the page for alcids. And you answer a few more questions until you get to a box with a stop sign. That box with a stop sign has 1 to a few species in it, and you check them all out. Here I've put in a species page. That's the thick-billed murre page. It's 1/2 of a double open page in our field guide. And you use those pages to look for key characteristics of that bird, to check out other similar species, and to compare the measurements that you've made of the bill, the wing, and the foot to the standardized range of measurements for that species. So in COASTS, there is no guessing. There is only using the keys to verify that the right characters are there. So you know with certainty that you've got the right dead bird. So why document dead birds? A lot of people ask me this. And of course I tell them, you know, they were once alive, right? And they can be identified by anyone. You don't have to have specialized equipment that's or expensive equipment like high-end binoculars or a spotting scope. You don't have to get up particularly early in the morning. You don't have to wear camouflage gear or sit in a blind. You can just walk along the beach until you come upon a dead bird like this one. They can be thoroughly examined and really easily photographed, and they can be identified by anyone because you have the bird in hand. Now, if we just found one dead bird in a blue moon, that wouldn't tell us much, but across lots of different sites, we find thousands of dead birds, and collectively they contain quite a lot of valuable information. So the Coast Beach Bird Stats, we've been going for a few years, over 20 years. As Gary mentioned, we currently have about 450 sites from Mendocino in Northern California up to Uktiavik, which is the coastal community formerly known as Barrow on the Arctic Circle. And then we run out the Aleutian Islands all the way to the Commander Islands, which are actually in Russia. We work in about 90 different coastal communities. And over the time that we've been extant in all of those communities, coasters have found about 88, maybe 90 now, thousand individual dead birds of just over 200 species. So we have quite a few participants at the moment, about 750 active people in our beach bird program. We've trained about 5,000 people since we started. And here are some basic stats. About 65% of coasters are female, about 15% of them either are currently engaged in or were engaged in some form of STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, fields, about 12% are in education, about 33% are retired. The average age of coasters is 51, but the range is quite broad, currently 7 to 87. Neither one of those people, the 7-year-old or the 87-year-old, go out by themselves. And interestingly, about 15% of coasters are in 2 or 3 generation families. So kids and their parents, grandkids and their grandparents, or all 3 generations at once. So although we didn't design it this way, it turns out that coasters see science as a social event at the same time as they see it as a very rigorous way to collect information that makes a difference in science and resource management. So how accurate are coasters? Well, let me tell you a little bit about coasters when they come to a training, and we do trainings online now, but we're getting back to in-person trainings. That's our standard. Takes about 5 or 6 hours to be trained in person to become a coaster. And when people walk into a training, one question we ask them is, where would you place yourself in terms of your ability to identify birds? Are you an expert? Are you advanced? Are you intermediate? Are you a beginner? Or would you list yourself as no experience? So only about 15% of coasters say, yeah, I'm an expert or I'm advanced at IDing birds. Only half of coasters identify as no experience or a beginner. So these are not necessarily Auduboners, right? They're not necessarily people with a high degree of experience of identifying birds. So let me just show you another graphic. This is a little more complicated. So on the X, or the horizontal axis, is previous experience in carcasses found. So each dot represents 1 or more coasters. The bigger the dot, the more people in it that are situated at a particular level of experience. That is, they've gone out and they found a lot of birds. If they're over on the right side of the graphic, they found between 400 and 500 birds. Not many people are over there. Far more people are over on the left side of the graphic. They found less than 100 birds. Now, what's on the vertical axis, the y-axis? That's carcass-specific accuracy in percent. So if you go out and you find a carcass and you identify it, what's the chance that you've got it right? So up at 100% would be every single carcass you've ever found, you got all the way to species, you were right, right? And the question is, where are coasters when they just start? They've been trained and they walk out of a training. So that's what we call the y-intercept. It's where that red line actually intersects the vertical axis, and that's at 70%. So remember that I just told you that half of coasters or pre-coasters walking into a training say, look, I'm a beginner, I have no experience at all. And yet, in their very first survey, they're 70% accurate. So that is the value of a good training and a good key and no guessing. But look at this, they can get even better than 70%. You see that red line, which is the model, the statistical model of our data. It goes up and then it flattens out. That flattened out part we call an asymptote. It's like a shelf. It's sort of average. You don't get better than that, but it's at about 80%. So it's almost 90%, which means almost 9 out of 10 carcasses are identified correctly to species. And that's phenomenal, not only because that's a really good number, but because 2/3 of those carcasses are rendered. They're not intact. So people are only seeing part of a carcass. Okay, so with all of this great data, what can we do? Well, sometimes we can do really fun things. We can find a species that nobody has ever found before. For instance, coast species number 183 is a purple gallinule. So those of you who know purple gallinules know from this Birds of North America map that they're all the way over down in Florida, right? And into the Caribbean. So we would not expect to see them in Washington state. And yet, here is a coast photograph of a wing, right? And so the coaster put on their slate, it's bird number 171 for them, and they wrote unknown because they don't know what it is, which makes sense because we would never have the purple gallinule in our bird guide because it's so rare. In fact, this was the first documented sighting of at least the wing of a purple gallinule in Washington state. So those are really fun kinds of stories. But the main thing that we do in COASTS is we create a baseline. We figure out what is normal in the question, who dies, where, when. So you're looking at a graphic, and on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, is time in months, right? And I'm showing you a picture of data from the northern outer coast of Oregon, right? From 2010 to 2011. Those are the gray bars. And superimposed over the gray bars is a black line with a yellow wash surrounding it. That black line is the long-term, over many years and many different sites in Northern Oregon. That's a long-term average. The black is actually the average signal, the line is, and the yellow wash is a signal of variance. Now, what is on the y-axis, the vertical axis? We call this encounter rate. It's the number of carcasses you would expect to find if you searched a kilometer of beach. All our beaches are different lengths, but we standardize to a kilometer so we can compare and average across our beaches. And so you can see here that in June, on average, if you're on a beach in Northern Oregon, you should expect to find just over 1 carcass per kilometer. But a scant 2 months later in August, you should expect to find between 5 and 6. So what's going on? Our average line is sort of a mountain range with 3 peaks, a big peak in August, a smaller peak in November, sometimes December, and then a little echo peak in the spring. Now, in 2010, 2011, you can see in that particular year, there wasn't actually a lot going on in August and September, but there was a ton going on in November and December. It was higher than normal. So I can take this 3-humped mountain range and I can repeat it over all of the years of the data. I can stretch out this graph. And by the way, you can do this on the COASTS website if you go to the Explore Data option. So when I spread it out over time, it looks a little like an EKG graph. It's just repeated. The baseline is repeated over and over again. And you can compare and contrast what actually happened by looking to see whether the gray bars are higher or lower or more or less the same as the average line. And you can see that over several years, they kind of look more or less the same. And that, of course, makes sense because we generate the average from all of the long-term data. So here, in fact, is the big graph that I showed you. Now, this is what it normally looks like. And we can see that, for instance, in the northern outer coast of Oregon, that first big mountain peak there in August is post-breeding mortality. That's exhausted parents leaving the colonies and dying because they just pushed it a little too far and they run out of gas. And that's young of the year chicks that don't make it. Right? So that's why we have a big peak there. That second peak is winter kill. That's the advent of declining temperatures and increasing exposure. Winter kill, in fact, is responsible for upwards of 50% of bird mortalities worldwide. The little peak in the spring is spring migration of our northern species in Alaska back up the coast of Oregon and Washington and into Alaska. So if I know something about what's normal and I know what's producing that pattern, I can then know when something goes wrong. And every now and then things go wrong. So in COASTS, we generate these graphics automatically. So our system tells us, oh my gosh, there's something going on. And in fact, we highlight those in red, and we call those catastrophic signals, also known as mass mortality events. This particular mass mortality event in Northern Oregon, which happened at the end of 2014 into 2015, was death of primarily one species, Cassin's auklets. It's a little bird about the size of my fist that's related to tufted puffins and common murres. And it's the first of the 3 dead bird stories that I want to tell you. So just a little bit about Cassin's auklets. The world population of Cassins is about 5.5 million, so not a lot of these birds. The center of the population is where the star is, which is the northwest tip of Vancouver Island, where the Scott Island group is. That's an archipelago of 5 islands. The outermost island, Triangle Island, alone houses about 2.5 to 2.7 million of these birds. So this guy's going to live about 6 to 10 years. It eats krill, small shrimp-like things, and other zooplankton. You can think of those as insects of the sea, and larval fish, small fish. It's a burrow nester, so it burrows underground, it breeds underground, takes both parents to raise the chick. Remember, I told you about that. And the conservation concerns are things like oil spills, introduce mammalian predators on the colonies. So here's some data about Cassin's auklet mass mortality events. We call these bullseye plots. So the center of the plot, the black part is the long-term average, and the big yellow part is the mass mortality event in the particular year. So these big circles here, big bullseyes here, mean that in that part of the coastline, in that month, so December here, right in the northern coast of Oregon, there are about 35 Cassin's auklets per kilometer, all the way down a stretch of about 100 kilometers every day for a month. That's a lot of birds. And because we had that baseline, what's normal information, not only for all birds, but for Cassin's auklets, we could tell that the rate that we were seeing Cassin's wash in was about 100 times normal. That's a pretty amazing thing. So we actually partnered with this guy, Parker McCready. He's an oceanographer in the School of Oceanography at the University of Washington. And he has created a very cool model called Live Ocean. And one thing that Live Ocean allows us to do is to look to see where particles that would float at the surface of the ocean might go over time on particular days if you place them there. And that's exactly what dead birds are. When a live bird can make decisions about where to go in the ocean, but the point at which the bird dies, it becomes a drifter. And so we used Parker's Live Ocean model to estimate if we put Cassin's auklets in particular places of the ocean on particular days, where they would go. So consider that all of these triangles are Cassin's auklets that I've just placed in Parker's model. And I'm going to start one series on the 19th of December on the left side. And I'm going to start the second one on the 22nd of December, just 3 days later on the right side. Now, in between the 19th and the 22nd, there are changes in wind direction. There are changes in current velocity. So we're going to just see, I've made two movies where these particles go. And if they hit the beach, they're going to stop there. So you can see they tend to corkscrew around a little bit, and that's the influence of the tide going in and out and in and out. But one thing that you can already tell is that if we released carcasses on the 19th of December, lots of them hit land. In fact, a lot of them go up to Canada. But just 3 days later, if we released carcasses, most of them stayed at sea. Hardly any of them came in. There's a whole stretch of coastline in Washington that there are no carcasses at all, and a few more of them arrived in Oregon. So where you die is really important, but what's going on with the local circulation patterns of the ocean is equally as important in generating the probability that you're actually going to hit land. So we use Parker's model and we cranked through lots and lots of simulations again and again, and we generated probabilities. So if we let a carcass float for just 3 days or just 5 days or 7 days, here is what we see. The thing that you need to take away from these maps is all of the gray squares. What's a gray square mean? A gray square means that no matter how many times we ran that simulation, and no matter what day of the mortality event we started it, none of those carcasses ever got to shore. So what Parker's model tells us is that it's not just death, it's death in the very close to shore environment. Now, close to shore is an oceanographic term, about 100 kilometers. So within 100 kilometers of shore, you have to be there in order to arrive on the coast. And that fact can allow us to understand how many birds died. So we use that fact and a few other modeling techniques to put together the story of Cassin's auklets. What happened? Well, first of all, the ocean was very, very warm in that period of time. And that very large amount of warm water sitting on the top of the ocean, about the size of continental Canada, changed the prey size and the kinds of prey from good calorie-rich prey like the krill and the copepod shown here to smaller prey that weren't as calorie-rich. So it basically changed how much good stuff is in the grocery store that you're trying to find. The other thing it did, the blob did, is it made it only a thin, narrow strip of water, about 150 kilometers, maybe 200 kilometers wide, hugging the coast of North America, colder than normal. That's blue in that sea surface temperature plot below. All of the rest of it, most of the North Pacific is red, warmer than normal. So the good food, the krill and the copepods, were fine in the cold water environment, but they were, the warm water environment was too warm for them. So where does a hungry Cassin's auklet that's just dispersing from Triangle Island go at the end of the season? Well, it goes into the cold environment. So all those 5.5 million birds came into that very narrow strip of ocean. Normally, they're out in the North Pacific, but that year they were in that narrow strip. And it turns out that that strip wasn't cold for long. So when fall came around, that big blob of warm water literally rolled in and pushed the cold water away. So that many of those birds that were in that narrow strip starved to death. And because they were so close to shore when they starved, we saw many more of them than normal. So what we learned from this is it's about large scale change in the environment, but it's also a story of physical oceanography. My next story is about common murres. These are larger alcids. So Cassin's auklets are small, about the size of my fist. Common murres are slightly larger. They're about 1 kilogram in weight. Football-shaped birds live about 20 years. They're eating slightly higher on the food chain than Cassin's auklets, so they're going to eat forage fish like anchovies or young herring or smelt, and they also eat krill. They breed on the surface. So remember, Cassin's auklets nested in burrows that they dig out, but murres breed on the surface. And it takes both parents to raise one chick. Their conservation concerns are oil spills, fishery bycatch, and climate. And you can see by this Birds of North America map that murres are all up and down the coast, right? So they're all the way down just south of San Francisco into Monterey. And then common murres are found all the way on up into the Bering and Chukchi seas. Okay, so these are pictures taken at Whittier Beach, which is in the Gulf of Alaska. It's actually in Prince William Sound on New Year's Day, 2016. So this is a year later than the Cassin story. And you are looking at what we call a wreck of birds. It's a massive, massive number of birds that have floated to shore. So they got tangled up in the wood on the back of the beach. Literally, the bodies became the rack line, right? Telling us where the highest water was on the last tide. And the number of birds counted on Whittier Beach alone, 6,800 birds on that one beach. Amazing numbers. So these are graphics of the number of murres that died, not just in the Gulf of Alaska, that's that graphic on the top, panel A, but down in Washington State, in Oregon, and in Northern California. Now you can see that I've actually superimposed here against these gray bars. That's what actually happened in that year, my standard black average line with the yellow wash. And you might be asking yourself, well, yeah, I kind of see that for the Washington, Oregon, and Northern California maps, but I don't see that yellow wash and that line for the Gulf of Alaska. Let me tell you why. In Northern California, there were about 5 times as many as normal murres during actually April, May, and June. In Oregon and in Washington, there was about 10 times normal, and those die-off months were concentrated in August and September during post-breeding mortality. In the Gulf of Alaska, hold on to your seats, 1,000 times normal. So the reason that you can't see that black line is it's so far down near the 0 line that it's not even visible in the graph. So, oh my goodness, 1,000 times normal. Concentrated throughout the Gulf of Alaska, but a lot in Prince William Sound. So coasters and others, everybody got involved in Alaska in this. They just found 46,000 carcasses. And our modeling work suggests that 500,000 minimum died in this one event alone. So what happened in this year? What's this story about? It's about the blob. The water was still warm. So that blob, the part of it that was up in the Gulf of Alaska, it, just like the Casson story, it changed the prey size and availability from larger forage fish to smaller forage fish. So there was basically less prey out there. At the same time, this is such an interesting story. Warmer water in the Gulf of Alaska that was resident now throughout the year, so warmer than normal for many, many months at a time, actually made the fish warmer, right? Because fish are cold-blooded, so they're the same temperature of the water. So if the water heats up, the fish heats up. If you're a big fish and you heat up, what happens? You eat more. So it's as if the big fish, including the commercially important fish like walleye pollock, it's as if they got bigger. They had a larger appetite. And so fewer forage fish and big fish with a bigger appetite mean that those big fish ate all the small fish, leaving hardly any for the birds. So the birds starved to death. Here's my third story. This is about tufted puffins. Tufted puffins are related to Casson's auklets and common murres. They're all alcids together. This is something about tufted puffin natural history. We're back underground. They're nesting underground. They lay one egg a year. They're deep divers. They fly underwater, just like murres. They winter throughout the North Pacific, and they don't have a lot of threats, occasionally eaten by owls. So this is a story that happened on St. Paul Island. It's in the Pribilofs, where there are about 6,000 puffins breeding, actually across both St. Paul and St. George, the two Pribilof islands. This is a story collected in conjunction with the Aleut community of St. Paul Island, and specifically their Ecosystem Conservation Office. So COASTS has been hosted by the Aleut community of St. Paul since 2006. And Ecosystem Conservation, or ECO for short, runs Bering Watch, and COASTS is part of Bering Watch. So the realities of St. Paul in the Pribilofs is that it's a cold place. These photographs were taken in the summer and the early fall when there's just snow before the ocean has iced up. It's a pretty small island, no trees on that island, but a lot of seabirds. This is the first day of the die-off, and this is the first photograph that we received from ECO. And you can see that there's actually a lot of dead birds in this photograph. They've labeled them for us: 2 murres, 8 adult horned puffins, 2 juvenile tufted puffins, and 27 adult tufted puffins. They arranged them very carefully by species and by intactness. In fact, during this outbreak, they created a new way of collecting data so that people who aren't trained in carcass identification can also collect data. We now call that die-off alert, and we train coastal residents throughout Alaska in die-off alert. So what happened on St. Paul? Here's a pie chart of all of the birds that washed in. So a little more speciose, more than one species, but tufted puffin made up, adult tufted puffins made up 76%. And then this next guy up here is juvenile, young of the year tufted puffins. So tufted puffins were the main species, and they washed in at 60 to 70 times normal rates. So the other really interesting thing about this is that they were in molt. So 95% of the tufted puffins that washed in had very, very short wings. And that's because they lose all their flight feathers once they have gotten to their wintering grounds. St. Paul is not their wintering ground, so they never made it to the wintering grounds. We also know that they were coming in droves because the native Arctic foxes on St. Paul that actually came over and inhabited St. Paul and St. George when the ice bridge was intact between Russia and Alaska. So they are native, they're not introduced. But there were so many birds coming in that there were too many for the foxes to eat. So almost all the birds were intact and almost all the birds were in molt. So this is a story where these birds didn't have enough to eat in the Bering Sea, and they delayed migration until it caught them out. They started to go into molt and they starved to death. So I told you these three stories. We also put these stories directly into the scientific literature. So here are some examples of our scientific publications. But most real people don't want to read scientific publications. So on the COASTS News and Views part of our website, you can look at science updates and read more about these, including something about the scientists who put them together and solved the mysteries of what was killing the birds. But I just want to make one more comment about seabird mass mortality at scale. So I've told you three individual stories, but what happens if we try and look at everything together? So this is kind of a complex plot, so let me walk you through it. What you're looking at below that sort of railroad track of time, which I'm going to populate in a minute, are ribbon plots where the colors tell you something about whether the sea surface temperature, SST, was warmer than long-term normal. So gold is above long-term 0. Red is 1 degree centigrade above normal, and dark red is 2 degrees or more centigrade above normal. So there are a lot of ribbons here. The one at the very top is labeled Chukchi. So that's bumping up to the Arctic Circle. The one at the very bottom is central to Northern California. So each ribbon is a different part of latitude from California all the way on up to the Arctic Circle. And you can see over time a few things happening that I want to point out. One is the North Pacific marine heat wave that I talked a little bit about. That's that big blob of warm water. So that you can see at the end of 2000 or at 2014 going into 2015, suddenly it was warm everywhere and the ocean got stuck on warm. It went from gold to red to dark red over a several-year period. So that massively changed the ecosystem. The second thing is that if you look at the Chukchi ribbon, you can see that there's a lot of warming. And in fact, it goes backwards in time. It's the only ribbon that's fairly warm going back to 2008 and 2007. This is a record of the fact that we see a lot more loss of Arctic sea ice. And this is an ongoing catastrophe in the Arctic region that lots of Arctic ecosystems are dealing with and many Arctic peoples are dealing with. So there's at least two sources of warming going on here: the North Pacific marine heat wave or the blob and the loss of Arctic sea ice. In fact, there was also an El Nino event on the backside of the heat wave. So three different sources of warming. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to populate that railroad plot there in time. And I'm going to put a big circle for each mass mortality event that we have ever seen in COAST. Now the size of the circle is going to tell you something about how big it was in terms of number of bodies. So the number of bodies found per kilometer of coastline. And the color is going to tell you about something about what kind of bird it is. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to look at that period of time before the marine heat wave hit. And here you can see that we do have mass mortality events. It wasn't that they didn't occur before the heat wave started. We definitely see them. You can see that the dots are all different colors, and that's because there are many different kinds of birds from different families, right? Alcids like rhinoceros auklets, Procellareas like northern fulmars, waterfowl like scoters, larids like black-legged kittiwakes. And most of the dots are fairly small. Some of them, like scoters, are bigger. Now, what happened when the heat wave hit? Oh my goodness, right? We got much, much bigger dots. I told you the story of common murres and Cassin's auklets. So we have lots more dots, and they're also more frequent, and they're also all one family. They're all alcids. So whereas they were diverse before, now they're not. They're centered on one family of birds. And as we move on and up towards the Arctic, we can see that alcids are still dying, but now they're joined by Procellareads, things like fulmars and shearwaters. And that's because up in the very northern part of the Bering Sea and the Chukchi and up into the Arctic, species change. And that's where the cold water Procellareads take over. So when you put all this together, what we can see is that when the ocean gets warm and stays warm, whether it's down in the open North Pacific or it's up in the Arctic, birds are going to lose because there's a big shift in food. So I hope I've convinced you that COAST actually makes a difference. But here are 7 reasons I think COAST makes a difference. And I've talked about some of them, but not all of them. Climate impacts. So I've definitely talked a lot about climate impacts. We also assess harmful algal blooms, changes in predator distribution and abundance. We look at fishery bycatch and fishery competition. We study disease outbreaks. We have our whole marine debris program. So we're looking at plastics ingestion and entanglement. And finally, we look at habitat change and population carrying capacity. So with all of this information, does it make a difference? I would say yes. This is a quote from one coaster from interviews that we did now several years ago, where the question that this person is answering is, for you personally, what's the value of what you are doing as a coast volunteer? So this person said a lot of things, but here's just one outtake. Just knowing you're contributing to something that has some value is important, because you've got an organization with almost 1,000 volunteers. The fact is that you're able to glean all sorts of information. That makes it purposeful and powerful. In fact, 97% of coasters identify the data and the information collected from the whole collective of all coasters, all doing the same thing month after month, as valuable. That's what allows us to do the science and tell our stories at scale. And it's not just me telling the stories. So we ask coasters, do you talk to other people about coast? And we ask them 2 kinds of people you interact with regularly, and communicators and decision makers. So let's look at people you interact with regularly. People in other environmental or community groups that you belong to, your neighbors, other people on the beach, your coworkers, your friends and family. So dark green is, yeah, I talk to these people all the time about coast. And light green is, yeah, well, I kind of rarely talk to them about coast, but everybody's talking to somebody about coast. So that's pretty amazing when you consider that we've trained 5,000 people, right? That's a lot of mouths, much, much louder than just my voice. But look at the bottom graphic. That's communicators and decision makers, like reporters or politicians or resource managers. Now, these kinds of people coasters talk to much less frequently. So white is, no, I've never talked to those people. And light green is, yeah, I've talked to those kinds of people once. And dark green is more than once. So some people look at this graph with glass half empty and say, well, Julia, look, this graph shows you that somewhere between 60 and 80% of your people never talk to communicators or decision makers. But I'm a glass half full person. And I would turn that around and say, yeah, but the graphic also says that between 20 and 40% of those people have talked to politicians and reporters and resource managers about coast. And remember that 5,000 number, that represents hundreds of people. So I have gotten calls from the governor's office of California and Oregon and Washington. Why? Not because they know me personally, because their voters have called the governor's office and said, I belong to the COAST program and we are doing really important science and you need to take a look at that. So the voice of coasters is really loud. So I want to leave you with a few aphorisms. One is science is for everyone. Scientists have to know their science. And if they do citizen science, you also have to know your participants, right? And you need to use each side, science and participants, to extend the other. And you can have an amazing, amazing program. And that's because at the end of the day, science is social. Science is a team sport. And so I'm asking you, who's on your team? Thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm happy to answer easy questions.
Did you come up with the idea of using carcasses as the baseline? When I read that, I thought it was brilliant because you have such a diversity of potential viewers that you could get a reasonable baseline. I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, you know, so it turns out there are definitely some beach birds programs that are longer, that started before ours, including some pretty brilliant ones in Europe, in the UK, in the Netherlands, some of them that have winked in and out in Spain and Portugal. And then there are a bunch of programs in New Zealand and Australia as well. And a few sister programs south of us in California. So we're the largest one now, but people have been monitoring things with dead birds for a while. They just haven't put the science stories together in the same way we have. So they've put annual reports together, kind of like doing the baseline, right? But haven't really been able to do the statistical work and modeling work that we've been able to do, and partner with the oceanographic community and the harmful algal bloom community, all sorts of different science communities to solve these mysteries of why the birds are dying. And so that, to me, that's the really powerful part that, and it's just tremendously fun to interact with people who, they know their beaches, they know what's there, they know tons about what's going on, and be able to take that information and move it into science, but also take the science information and move it back to communities, and show communities what they're finding and why it's changing. It's really, really exciting.
So, Julia,
Yeah.
would you be able to gather this level of data without citizen scientists?
Madonna, that is an amazingly good question. And the answer is just plain no, absolutely not. There is no way that we could gather this information other than with citizen science. So, when the common murre die-off happened in 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game got very, very involved, and they deployed people to go out and float planes and boats. They spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get people to go out and collect carcasses for that one event, which they did. That's why we got 46,000 carcasses. But what their statisticians told them is, that's great, but that's not telling us anything, right? We need a baseline. And the only program that collected a baseline over all those years is COASTS. So if we hadn't had the Alaskan citizen scientists out there from 2006 on, month in and month out, creating that baseline, we would have no idea. We would know a lot of birds died, but we wouldn't be able to tell how far above normal it was. We wouldn't be able to do the population work. So the involvement of coastal residents is absolutely crucial. It's vital to the science that we do. Great question.
I'm also wondering, you've been doing this for 22 years, and that one chart you had with the ribbons of color, it suggests that the climate change acceleration is very real. Is that over those 22 years, are you seeing that just ramping up?
It definitely is. Climate is a really variable thing. So it's noisy, goes up and down and up and down. The temperature does. I would say that the ocean is a pretty good way to measure that. And that's because it takes a lot of energy to heat water, right? A lot more than it takes to heat air, which is why, by the way, in a 24-hour cycle in the air, the temperature can go up and down 20 or 30 or even 50 degrees, but it can't do that in the water. And that's because it takes so much energy to heat the water. So we can think about that in reverse, which means if the whole surface of the ocean, and so that's the mixed layer of the ocean, which can be 30, 40, 50, 100 meters deep. To heat all of that 1 degree takes a phenomenal amount of energy. So that tells us, yeah, there's really persistent warming going on. The other thing is that phenomena, the North Pacific marine heat wave, aided and abetted by climate change, but also a phenomena that we now are seeing worldwide, heat waves. And these are large places of persistent warming for at least months, if not years. And they give us a window into the future. So the North Pacific kind of went back down a little bit. It's a little bit more towards normal now, but we could really see over a several year period, well, what's this ecosystem going to look like now, right? It's going to have different prey species, and that's going to set different capacity, carrying capacity, the number of birds of of a species that can be maintained. And so that gives us a little bit of time to think, okay, well, you know, that might put these kinds of populations or these places more at risk. And now we can be more planful. I don't think we can change that, but we can definitely be more planful.
I didn't want to hog the time, but I actually did have a little odd question.
Sure.
I noticed on your slide on tufted puffins, they're eaten by owls. What owls?
Snowy. Great.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. They get nailed. Yeah. You know, because they're sitting on the edge of the cliff. Damn.
Huh.
Yeah. Owls are pretty fearsome, you know. You gotta, anything that has a, you know, owl, I'm totally into bird feet. Owl feet, most bird feet are 3 front toes, 1 rear toe. And that's what raptors have, right? Where their nails are claws, so they can do that. Owls, their toes, their outside toe can swivel around the other way. So it's 2 front, 2 back to grab. Super cool. You know, I'm glad owls don't get as big as velociraptors, because man, no human would be safe. They're really quiet and they're really fast, and man, those talons are really sharp.
One quick question. I assume that the folks that are involved, your volunteers, they have to be living on the coast and spending a lot of time. And there's probably not a whole lot that, you know, folks like us that are, you know, 7 hours away are going to do to volunteer. Is that a fair assumption?
That's a lot of dedication, right? That would be a lot of dedication to go all the way to the coast monthly. What I can tell you is, in some places, coasters don't want to go more than about, you know, they would be willing to get in their car and go about 15, 20 kilometers, but not much farther than that. Some coasters really do. They'll come from sort of central south Washington, you know, like Chehalis kind of area, or they live in Portland and will drive out to the outer coast. In Alaska, we have people that literally will drive to the airport, get in their float plane, fly out to the Alaska Peninsula to go do coast on the beach. That's a very Alaska thing. But yeah, it takes, yeah, it would be a little hard. I would love to train people in Spokane, but I think it might be more of a interesting thing than a monthly requirement. That would be a little untoward. But you know, I thought it'd be fun to come talk to you guys anyway and just introduce you to Coast and what we do.
Well, it's a wonderful program. Obviously, you've done a tremendous job. But yes, I'm not sure exactly how we can use it, except I thought there were some interesting takeaways. I love your training.
Yeah.
It seems, boy, we ought to find a way to take advantage of that type of an example. But you're right. There aren't a lot of ways that we can take advantage. But wonderful, yeah, wonderful, and wonderful job over 22 years.
Well,
What a fabulous.
Thanks so much. And please, I invite you all to check out the Coast website. It's very easy to get to. www.coast.org gets you there. And you can zoom around. We do online training. So if my talk tonight has convinced you really want to know more about dead birds in the marine environment, you can certainly sign up our Coast Light training. That's our online training if you don't particularly want to come out to a beach, but you want to just know a little bit more. It's pretty fun.
I did see that, yes.
Excellent.
Great stuff, great stuff.
Well, thanks for having me, everybody. Great to touch base with the eastern side of the state.
Yes.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Julia, do you know of any kind of group that does that around like the gorge and the windmills in that area? Is there something?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. I don't, and I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. I am ignorant even of who has permission to walk near the wind turbines. And there's a lot of private land, I'm sure that's leased for them, but certainly that is a ongoing source of mortality for migratory birds. And we're actually facing that same issue along the coast now, because there's talk about putting in very, very large wind turbines in the coastal environment, as large as oil derricks. So yeah, I think that this is monitoring that kind of mortality is just ripe for a citizen science program. I don't know that I'm up for starting one, but y'all should think about that.
I noticed Dave Cruft left a chat that said that the companies hire folks to monitor that.
Is that information shared?
I don't know. I met their interests are obviously somewhat different than the the environmental folks. So who knows? But that's where we are.
Yeah, well, knowing the flyways and then getting that repeated what is found under the turbines would actually, that's anthropogenic mortality, but you will create a baseline, and then you would be able to see if things shifted. If a flyway becomes more intense, or the timing shifts a little bit, or the wind velocity changes, right? Your tip speed is going to change. And so all of those things, those data over the long term could be very, very useful in helping companies to figure out when they wanted to stop turbines because it was a particularly bad year or a bad storm or a bad time. So, you can envision a program that was working with the companies, not against them, to make them better stewards. Go for it. My God, that sounds like a great thing. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to go have dinner. So thanks a lot for having me. Really enjoyed the chance to give a talk.
We enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much.